What we're going to talk about is mixing starch and how to cook a perfect batch of starch. There is no cut and dry recipe necessarily as far as measurements go. It all is going to depend on how hot the water is boiling, what altitude you're at, and what kind of starch you are actually using. The kind of starch that we use for scenic painting is this Argo laundry starch. The only place that I can really find this is through a theatrical supplier. So we order ours from Rose Brand, which is a huge distributor out of New York. So it's very cheap. I think that these run about $4 per box, and this box is going to make about 5 gallons worth of starch. So what you have to do is you do have to cook it. So that's the trick, right? So what I'm doing is I've got a large stock pot right here on the stove. This is about 2.5 gallons of water total. And I have filled this about 2/3 full of water. Again, there's no secret recipe. I'm not measuring. And then typically what I'll do is I'll get a 1 gallon empty paint bucket, and I will fill it about 3/4 full of cold water. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the laundry starch, and I'm going to mix about half of this box into the 1 gallon of water. Not a perfect science as far as the measurements. So I just go ahead and I'm going to just pour about half of that in there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a whisk and just stir that up. What it wants to do is it wants to sort of settle on the bottom. So as we move forward with the process, we will go ahead and just continue to stir that. So as you can see, I've got my cold starch water, which is sort of a milky white, and then I've got my hot boiling water that we're going to make the starch in. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn this is on about medium. I'm going to turn it on to high, and then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this little ladle. Usually in your paint shop you're going to have some really amazing grungy looking ladles, and you're just going to start to very, very slowly, you're going to just ladle in that cold starch water into the hot boiling water. And as you can see there, I kind of made it stop boiling. You don't want to do that. Make sure that the water keeps boiling. So you don't want to kill the boil as you're adding your cold starch water into the hot boiling water. So I'm just going to kind of trickle it in a little bit. And as you can see, it's continuing to boil. So what is the purpose of using starch for scenic painting? The main purpose for using starch is to create a barrier between the muslin that you're painting on and the paint that you put on that. Because that muslin is cotton, and what it wants to do is it wants to absorb the paint, the liquid, and you can add tons and tons and tons of paint and it will continue to just absorb that, where this laundry starch sort of creates this nice surface to paint on. Your paint and your pigments will sit on the starch, not absorbing into the muslin or canvas. So when I'm making starch, typically there's 2 reasons for it. If I'm painting some soft scenery, soft flats, which muslin covered flats would be soft covered flats, or if I'm painting a large backdrop, that's when I typically need to make starch and use it. So when I paint a large backdrop, say a 20 foot by 50 foot backdrop, what I'll do is I will prepare this at home and take it with me. Typically, I would say I would need 4 to 5 batches of starch, which is about 10 gallons of starch. So instead of just soaking it with paint layer after layer after layer. We're going to save a ton of money by starching that muslin first. The other thing that it does is it keeps the backdrop, that painted canvas backdrop, lightweight. This is going to keep it very lightweight. You're not going to have to add as much paint, where the paint will actually get really, really heavy. And once you have more than, you know, a couple of layers of paint, when you try to fold up that backdrop, it's going to crack and peel and be really cumbersome. When I'm making starch for the scenic painting projects, I'll typically make one batch of starch, which is 1/2 box, equals about 2 to 2.5 gallons of starch. That's enough for everyone in the class to cover their flat with one nice layer of starch. The reason I make the starch at home is because you have to keep that water really hot. I've tried to do it on sort of little surface burners, and you just can't keep the water hot enough to create the consistency that is needed for starch. When we use starch for our projects, we will typically use a 4-inch chip brush and we'll just paint it on our flats. When you see professionals painting large scale backdrops, particularly if they're laid on a paint deck down, typically what they'll do is they'll do a Hudson sprayer. So they'll spray out the starch, and then a couple of members of the team will use large push brooms to sort of distribute that starch. So at this point, I've gotten about half of my cold starch poured into the hot boiling starch. And as you can see, this is sort of the consistency of maybe skim milk as it goes in. The water's been boiling for a little while now, and so it is starting to thicken up. So as I pour that, you can see it's sort of getting thicker, maybe at about 2% milk. So what we want to do is we want to get this starch to continue to thicken by not killing that boil, and in the end it will be about the consistency of gravy. Now, if you want a nice brown smooth gravy, not chunky Renee's Thanksgiving Day gravy. And if you let this cook for too long, you will just have a blob of gelatinous starch. So I've got about 1/4 of my cold starch left, and I'm pouring it in. I've maintained a really, really nice boil, so it's not at all chunky, or what will tend to happen is it just will never thicken up if you continue to kill off the boil. What's happening is I can see it as it's boiling that it's kind of moving a little bit slower. Ooh, I gotta be careful, it'll boil over. And it's starting to really thicken up quickly now. So now I really need to keep an eye on it, because the goal's not to get the entire cold starch content into the hot starch. The goal is to have a really nice, smooth starch. So I anticipate that I'm not going to get my entire container of cold starch into the hot starch. So you can see right now that it's running off a little bit more like cream, which is great. We're getting pretty close. I'm going to continue to add my cold starch, mostly to prevent it from boiling over. Don't ever walk away, because it will make a mess out of your stove. We're really getting close. We're almost there. So you can see it's pretty smooth but thick. Gonna add a little bit more. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop adding the cold starch, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to shut off the heat. It's still going to stay hot and it'll continue to thicken up a little bit. I'd say at this point we've got ourselves a pretty nice starch. So here we have our starch, and it's a little bit later. And you'll notice that it's kind of got this film right here on the top. And that's all right. You're just going to want to kind of peel that off and throw it away. If you look at the actual starch, it's the consistency of paint. Thanks for tuning in.